Hello everyone, this is Ohio Dan. Today's video is basically a thought experiment or a form of analogy that I've called the PETA Principle. And this principle, as I'm going to describe in this video, is sort of my take on human nature as it applies to things like men's issues or basically anything else that falls within the sort of category that this analogy applies to, but primarily men's issues, men's problems, the sort of struggle in greater society for men to have their problems taken seriously, and that sort of thing. So the PETA principle basically goes like this. Consider the concept of going into a community of people that has no respect for animal rights and trying to get them to join an animal welfare organization like PETA. And I'm pretty neutral when it comes to animal rights. Like, I'm not extreme one way or the other. I think animals should have rights. You shouldn't be allowed to torture or kill animals for no reason. But I'm not so much of an advocate for animal rights that I feel emotional about it either way. And that's why I like to use this as an analogy. But let's say you have a community of people that for whatever reason, they're somewhat isolated from larger society, they're somewhat isolated from the rest of civilization, and let's just say that they have been raised their whole lives that, killing animals for no good reason whatsoever, or torturing them, or doing whatever other horrible things. I don't really need to go into great detail, I think, to make the point. Let's just say that they've been raised their whole lives to think that that's okay, and to think that there shouldn't be any negative consequences for that animals basically don't deserve to have rights. And let's say that you go into that community as a representative of PETA or whatever animal welfare organization you want to look at. I use PETA because they're obviously the most well-known. You're not going to make any sort of progress doing that, are you? You're just going to, at best, get those people to laugh at you and not take you seriously. And at worst, those people will actually run you out of town for challenging their beliefs, challenging what they feel is their right to do, their right to basically treat animals however they want, regardless of any sort of consideration for those animals. You're not going to make progress with those people because they've been taught their whole lives that your point of view is wrong, that animals don't deserve to be treated in that sort of way, that they could just do whatever they want, and how dare you tell them otherwise. That's going to be the realistic response. If you had a community of people like that, you're not just all of a sudden going to allow them to see the light, so to speak, and allow them to realize that animals probably shouldn't be tortured, that animals probably should be treated with some level of respect. If they've been taught their whole lives not to think that way, you're not going to just go into that community of people and just based on compassion or the idea of having compassion for animals in this case, get them to join your organization. They're going to oppose you with everything that you tell them to do, and if you're lucky, you might get out of town in one piece. You might be able to leave that community without them actually attacking you physically. If your starting point is that you're dealing with people who simply don't care about the group in question, then none of the reasoning you use will be effective in convincing them to support that group. This is the essence of the PETA principle, right? You're not going to go into a community of people that has no respect for animal rights and get them to join PETA. It's not going to happen. That's just not how human nature works. In the case of men and men's rights, basically no one in greater society cares about their problems, no matter how significant those problems may actually be. Therefore, it matters little, according to this principle, as I've made this analogy, it matters little how much evidence says that men actually need help or consideration. Because, in fact, in our society, people have been taught their whole lives for many generations that men don't deserve help, that men have oppressed women throughout all of history, that things are one-sided in men's favor because men are privileged. Even though the evidence doesn't back that up, both traditional conservatives and feminist or left-leaning people have been raised for generations now to believe that way. And men have always had the onus of being providers and protectors throughout nearly all of human history. But today especially, people have been raised to basically disrespect and look down on men. And so, to use the PETA principle, you're not going to all of a sudden convince people that they need to care about men's rights just based on the need, just based on facts and evidence. If people have been raised their whole lives not to think that way, which is indeed the case here, they're not going to care about men's problems. They're not going to be persuaded by these arguments. And so while you might be able to convince 1 out of 100 people or so, whatever the number may be, that men deserve compassion, the people that are actually thinking for themselves, the people that actually have a strong sort of set of values and they don't basically take their cues from society, they actually decide what's wrong and what's right for themselves, you might be able to convince them that men have problems and deserve compassion. But the vast majority of people simply won't care unless there are actual consequences to themselves as individuals. The basis of the PETA principle is that unfortunately this is just how human nature works, because people are generally amoral and only have compassion for things that affect them directly, that actually have some sort of impact on their lives. If they don't necessarily feel any sort of impact from something directly, or they haven't been through a negative situation of some sort, then they're not going to have compassion just based on the idea of you making a convincing argument or showing them that the right thing to do is to care about men's issues with the family courts, or men's issues with the workplace environment post-Me Too, or men's issues with not having reproductive rights, or the sentencing gap, or any of that type of stuff. People aren't going to care unless it affects them. Most people are effectively amoral. Now, this is my opinion, right? This isn't something that you can prove beyond a shadow of a doubt. So I'm not pretending that there's a factual sort of way of looking at this, but everything that I see shows that people are, for the most part, amoral. It's very rare to encounter a person that can really truly be persuaded to change their mind on something that they have strongly held beliefs on, or they've been taught, in this case, their whole life to have a certain point of view on. It's very rare to meet someone that will actually be convinced by reason or compassion and saying, hey, you know what, we care about this group of people here, we care about women at this level, maybe we should actually care about men. And maybe we would discover through that process of caring about women and men equally that men are actually getting the short end of the stick when it comes to a lot of things. Maybe it's not right to strip fathers from their children. Maybe it's not right that only men have gender-based expectations of being providers and protectors while women are strong and empowered and liberated from their gender roles. Maybe it's not right that we should consider whether women should have the right to abortion of convenience while men don't have any reproductive rights whatsoever. Maybe we actually need to consider men's point of view here and have some empathy and compassion for what may happen to them in a workplace scenario if an accusation is made, and how they may indeed just avoid women at work as much as possible, especially in their personal lives outside of work. Instead, you're not going to get that. You're just going to get men need to do better because that's what we've been taught, and it doesn't really affect me to say that men are bad, so I'm just going to go ahead and go along with the common rhetoric and just virtue signal, right? Virtue signaling is a big part of what I'm talking about here. That's just what you're going to get from most people, from everything that I've seen. People just do basically whatever they can get away with, and most people are amoral. Maybe that hasn't always been the case. Maybe you could argue that that's not a constant element of human nature. I think that it probably is, but definitely in today's society, that's what I see most people doing. The idea that most people have a strong moral compass just doesn't seem to pan out from anything that I've seen. It's very rare to encounter people that aren't just generally amoral with how they go about these things. So much like how PETA would not succeed in winning people over who aren't concerned about animal welfare, that just have been taught their whole lives that they don't need to care about animal well-being, men's rights activists likely won't succeed by that same token in large measure to convince people to care about men on the basis of treating everyone fairly. Now, there is a huge difference, though, with this analogy. There is a point where this analogy with animal rights doesn't completely correlate, and that is with men having the ability to make decisions for themselves. Animals can't organize or decide that they're just going to quit and not be part of a society anymore. Animals are pretty much completely dependent on their owners. And so if you have a community of people like what I've mentioned here that doesn't really respect animal rights, there's not much that you can necessarily do unless you have basically the power to find those people. You have the power to throw those people in jail, right? If you kill an animal for no good reason, you get to spend a month in jail. Or if we catch you abusing an animal or neglecting your pets, we're going to fine you a significant amount of money. Then all of a sudden, that would start affecting people directly. But the animals themselves don't really have the ability to do anything about that situation. Men, on the other hand, can. Men can essentially do something to make it to where everyday life for people changes, because men are no longer available to basically do what society and what women expect of them. That's the only sort of mechanism for change. If there is any remaining chance to reform the current system in terms of how it treats men, and also the culture as a whole, so that it treats men and women both fairly, so that men actually get a fair deal in terms of a lot of the things that I've mentioned: reproductive rights, the family courts, gender roles, the way the workplace works. It can only come by essentially punishing people for continuing to support a one-sided system that heavily favors women in their interactions with men. That's the only way that things can change. That's sort of the idea, the concept behind the PETA Principle, is that when you have a society full of people that thinks that, well, this is okay, even though really what they think is okay is immoral. They think that doing certain things is good when in reality it's bad. If you don't have the power to essentially punish that group of people for what they're doing, you're not going to see change. Unfortunately, that's just the way it is. And that's the point of this video, basically. You can't just convince people out of compassion and empathy that they need to change. You actually have to essentially apply negative consequences if they don't change, or positive consequences for actually starting to do the right thing. And you can question whether morality is objective or not. That goes beyond the scope of anything that I'm saying here. But just basically saying or assuming that treating animals poorly is wrong, you're not going to convince people of that if they've been raised their whole lives to think that that's not the case. In our society as it actually is today, just pointing out that the way that men are treated is wrong is not going to change a damn thing. People are not generally motivated by that. People only change when you essentially force them to change. That's the underlying idea that I have here. You're not going to go into a society of people that hate animals and convince them to join PETA. You're not going to convince a society full of people that basically disrespect and more or less hate men, in many cases at least, and convince them to support men's rights or men's issues. Unfortunately, that's just not part of how human nature works, at least in my opinion, and from everything that I've seen over the years. So, how do you punish the system? I'm not talking about violence for anybody that wants to misconstrue what I'm saying here. I'm not talking about punishing society by doing bad things to society directly, but walking away from things like marriage, walking away from conventional relationships, walking away from anything that is obsessed with basically giving women what they want at your expense, right? This sort of punishment process, in the way that I'm talking about it here, is why you see women saying, oh, where are all the men? Why aren't men protecting us? Why don't men want to marry us? Why is it that men have this sort of negative way of going about things with women? Why don't we have mentor her in the workplace, right? To some degree, women are being punished by supporting feminism and gynocentric policies and cultural norms. But it's not nearly enough to really change society at this point. Without men ultimately walking away from conventional relationships, gender roles, and a lot of the other things that I've been mentioning in large numbers, it seems unlikely that change can really be accomplished in terms of society really giving a crap about men's issues. And that's unfortunate, but the point of this video basically is to kind of have a thought experiment that illustrates why just advocating for reform directly definitely is not going to work. If there is a remaining chance to make things better for men in this society, it's going to be by men essentially punishing the system, punishing women, punishing this anti-male, we're going to make everything men's fault, but then we're not going to help men through any of the struggles they face sort of mentality or approach. There's got to be punishment for that. And unless that punishment gets to the point where society is forced to actually take men's problems seriously, then it never will. That's more or less the point of applying the PETA principle to where men stand. Yes, men, unlike animals, could theoretically organize and advocate for their rights, but unfortunately we don't see them doing so very much. We don't see men really coalescing as one group, organizing for all of their issues against the family courts as they are now, demanding an end to things like no-fault divorce, demanding an end to Me Too, demanding an end to the Duluth model for domestic violence. We don't see men organizing effectively, but men at the very least can withhold their utility value. They can withhold the fruits of their labor. They can stop participating in a system that hates them, at least at the individual level. Whether or not men effectively organize to help each other out, that's kind of what the men's community is attempting to do. A lot of people have argued that the men's community has failed in that regard, and I can kind of understand that point of view, at least to a large extent. But there also are men within the men's community that are helping each other out. It's just that it's not going to be a societal-wide thing, most likely. Nonetheless, that is really the only chance that things can improve for men at the macro level, is if men punish the system and punish the women that support this system and the men that support this female-centric, everything that men do is bad, women always need more, but at the same time men are suffering in regard to a lot of different things. The only way that's going to improve from a guy's perspective is if the system is essentially punished enough to where people are like, hey, wait a second, if we don't start to include men, if we don't start to help men that are struggling, if we don't start to consider their issues, this society is going to collapse. Unless people, by and large, figure that out, and that becomes more widespread knowledge, there's no way that things are going to get better for men. And most likely this is not going to work. Most likely it's not going to be enough, because the entire culture and the entire basis of so many of the things that we do now, policy-wise, are based on just taking advantage of men. They're just based on men essentially taking responsibility for things that they don't have any control over anymore. The idea that men somehow should still basically bear the burden of basically making a society function when that society hates them. So much of what our society is based on now really relies on that to such a degree that I don't know how much punishment would be necessary to actually reform things. I think it's more likely that society will collapse. And honestly, I think that's what we're headed toward anyway, for a lot of different reasons. Our national debt being a pretty clear example in the United States, at least. But to basically conclude and wrap up this video, the PETA principle basically illustrates, or it's my attempt to illustrate, the idea that most people are amoral. You can't just reach people based on reason and compassion and showing them that the right thing to do is to take this sort of action, or to change your view on something, or to develop your way of thinking when it comes to particular issues. That generally doesn't work. Unless something affects a person directly in their actual everyday life, they're probably not going to give a crap. And they're probably just going to go along with this whole post-feminism or traditional conservative way of looking at things that, women are somehow still oppressed and men are bad and men need to do better. As long as people can get away with virtue signaling that sort of thought process, or it's not even a thought process, but that position, that particular stance, then that's what they're going to do. They're not going to start caring about men because you think that's what they ought to do. You're not going to go into a community of people that has no respect for animal rights and convince them to join PETA. By that same reason, you're not going to convince people that they ought to care about men's problems and men's issues when they've been raised their whole lives to blame men for everything and to still hold men accountable and responsible for everything. You're not going to convince them that men actually need to get more help at this point. Most likely, the only way that you can convince them of that is to withdraw from the system and not give the fruits of your labor as men to that system. Then there may be some remaining chance to reform things. But unless you can essentially punish people enough for having the views that they have, things are not going to get better for men on that basis. You're not going to convince a society of people that hate men, or at the very least look down on men a great deal, to all of a sudden start caring about men's issues, because unfortunately, as I've tried to illustrate here with the PETA principle, that's just not the way that things work within human nature. And instead, unless you can basically force the system to change by affecting people's everyday lives enough, which is unlikely to happen, I think, you're never going to have reforms, I think, in this society that actually try to help men.